Hi, my name is McComas, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative and a co-author with Matthew Kahn of the new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. In this new webcast series, we explore themes discussed in our new book by diving deep into the history and future of the 6 post-industrial cities of Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. We look at ways in which these cities can improve outcomes for people, neighborhoods, and businesses, and how they can attract new residents and investments so that everyone can reach their full potential. Today, I'm honored to be joined by my co-author, Matthew Kahn, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business and Director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins, and Emily Badger to discuss our new book, and in particular, gentrification. Emily Badger is a reporter at the New York Times, where she writes about cities and urban policy for the Upshot from the Washington Bureau. Her writing and reporting covers the topics of housing, transportation, and inequality, and how they're all connected. She has been with the Times since 2016, and before then worked at the Washington Times. Hi, Emily, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So gentrification has become a popular topic of discussion, over the past decade and in recent years, but the phenomenon goes back even further than that. As crime rates declined in many U.S. cities and urban areas in the 1990s and 2000s, many white homeowners who had previously avoided city centers started to buy homes in downtown areas. Is this a simple story of changing perceptions of public safety, or was being close to restaurants and theaters and cafes and bars and where the action is and having shorter commutes just as important? And did this new generation of urban livers equally not want to live in the suburbs?
So one thing that I am confident of is that absolutely none of the processes that we're going to talk about are simple stories. This has been made clear to me through writing about this stuff for a long time. It's all incredibly knotty and complex. And the question that you raised in particular about like what has been driving higher income, more highly educated, more white residents into city centers, I think is a product of a whole bunch of things simultaneously. It has to do with, yes, the changing kind of lifestyle preferences of millennials and a newer generation of city dwellers. I think it has to do with commute fatigue. As commutes have grown longer, it just makes less sense for a lot of people, especially if you don't have children, to spend, an hour of your time every day in the car. As you have more disposable income, things that you might spend it on, like going to restaurants, bars, cultural amenities and things like that, I think have become more popular. But I do also think that, all of those things are contributors, but we would not really be talking about any of them to the way that we are right now if we were still looking at crime rates in American cities like we had in the early 1990s. I mean, I just think it's foundational to everything else that has happened that we're just talking about radically safer cities now than we had, when I was growing up in Chicago in the 80s and 90s. And sometimes maybe people lose sight of that, I think, especially because, we see in this kind of amusing opinion polling data that most Americans believe that crime is getting worse, and they have constantly believed that it's been getting worse, even though it's been exactly the opposite. And of course, if you listen to political rhetoric, you might think that it's been the opposite for quite a long time. But I just think that people's sense of safety is so vital to whether or not they want to be in a space, not just whether or not you want to live in a space, but whether or not you want to visit it or pass through it or walk down a sidewalk, that just sort of taking, fear of crime off the table or reducing it for a lot of people makes so many other things possible in these urban environments that we're talking about.
I think that that's such an important point that I grew up in New York City in the early 70s. It was not a 24-hour-a-day city, and so many possibilities opened up, and New York became so much funkier when it was a 24-hour-a-day city. To my parents, it's night and day.
Yeah, I mean, to go back and reread news stories from the 80s and 90s about a lot of these different cities. I mean, it just sounds like they're talking about a totally different city, you know, not New York City a generation ago, not Washington, D.C. a generation ago. I mean, just I think it's especially hard for people who are sort of relative newcomers to relocating to these places to just imagine how dramatically they have transformed in this period of time.
So as this transformation occurred and you had this influx of white homeowners and increasingly gentrified downtown areas, how did the influx of these people change cultural, commercial, and sort of development patterns in downtown areas and sort of relative to surrounding suburbs?
One of the things that I often encounter in trying to write about this is this sort of debate between, on the one hand, there are some people who believe gentrification is happening everywhere, you know, and in every neighborhood you look, it's underway, it's this ever-present problem. And then on the other hand, you know, people saying, no, this is all just navel-gazing by people who think about this stuff who happen to live in Washington and New York, and it's, you know, really a coastal city phenomenon. And so part of what I've spent a lot of time trying to do is kind of like tease out like what actually is the reality between those extremes as we're sort of describing what's happening in American cities across the country. And what I've sort of arrived at concluding is that, you know, we can see, if we look at, for instance, like home price index data, you know, that tells us where property values are rising and how fast they're rising. If we look at those all over the country, we see that property values closest to central cities have been escalating, accelerating the fastest relative to, you know, further out neighborhoods or even relative to the suburbs over the past, you know, 20, even 30 years, sort of suggesting that, you know, people's sense of the value of these neighborhoods is growing and is growing relative to other kinds of places. So that is not just a, you know, New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. story. That's, you know, this is a story that is true in lots of communities all over the country, that close to downtown urban real estate has really been, you know, has grown dramatically more valuable in lots of different kinds of places. So to me, that sort of argues for we're talking about something more pervasive here. But when people talk about gentrification, it's also sort of unclear. Are we talking about socioeconomic change at the neighborhood level? Are we talking about racial change at the neighborhood level? So we've also done some work looking at this with some of my colleagues at the Times, where, you know, we've looked at demographic change at the census tract level, basically in every census tract in the country. And again, one of the things that we see is that in census tracts very close into downtowns, there is a growing share of the white population in neighborhoods that had been predominantly non-white for a very long time. And that's something that we also see, not, again, you know, not just in Brooklyn and, you know, in close in Washington, D.C., you know, we see it in Raleigh and Durham and Indianapolis. And, you know, again, it is much more widespread than I think people think. But, you know, it's, in these cities where it's happening, we're talking about a relatively small number of neighborhoods. So it's not pervasive in the sense that it's happening everywhere, but it's happening in a small number of neighborhoods in a large number of cities. So there is something more pervasive that's happening here. And the other thing that we've looked at the Times, we did a project a couple years ago where we were using Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data to look at like who is buying homes and how does the socioeconomic profile of those home buyers compare to the people who've already been living in the neighborhood. And we see in these close to downtown neighborhoods that had been predominantly non-white, that there are many places where the majority of mortgages in those census tracts are going to white home buyers. And they're going to white home buyers who make a lot more money than the median for the census tract. So that tells us that, you know, it is in fact true that higher income white residents are moving into close-in census tracts. And, again, you know, this isn't happening everywhere, but it's not limited to coastal cities. It's happening in a small number of neighborhoods in a large number of cities. So there is real neighborhood change happening in lots of different cities around the country. And, you know, I wouldn't dismiss that as, you know, I live in Washington, and so I pay a lot of attention to this because it's clearly going on around me. It's not just happening in Washington, but it's also, you know, it's somewhere in between those extremes of this is happening everywhere, and really it's not a big deal. We don't need to talk about it as much as we do.
Mac, let me ask you a question there. So in our Baltimore, my neighborhood at Liberty Harbor East, Mac, it was a Superfund site before I showed up. Can you briefly tell that story that exemplifies Emily's point?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing in Baltimore is, you know, looking back to the 1990s, you had a downtown in Inner Harbor that, you know, was a former industrial site. And so you have Harbor East in particular was a neighborhood where an old chromium factory was located. And now on top of that site is this massive glass tower headquarters of Exelon Corporation. And just sort of this, you know, high density apartment buildings, the best restaurants in the city. I mean, it's night and day compared to what it was 30 years ago. And, you know, in the case of Baltimore, there was a pretty clear push by Baltimore city government to drive redevelopment from the Inner Harbor and the downtown, with the idea that it would sort of filter out from there after that happens. Now, whether that actually happened or not is up for debate, but I can't really see a whole lot of evidence for that in Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, these close-in neighborhoods have had a lot going for them. I mean, they guarantee you short commutes. They have better transit access than a lot of other neighborhoods, you know, particularly in the kind of cities you guys are talking about. They have this sort of fabulous building stock, which in some cases, this fabulous building stock is still around because no one, you know, they were so neglected, these neighborhoods, for such a long time that nobody even bothered to tear them down. So now that it comes around that 50 years later, we care about this stuff again, it's still there. I mean, there's just, it's not surprising that we see the same kinds of neighborhoods going through these processes in lots of different cities because they all have the same kind of underlying ingredients in them.
Yeah, and I think, again, building on that point, you know, what you see in Baltimore and a lot of these other cities is they were building off existing assets, such as, you know, a theater downtown, but it's a theater that's close to, you know, old bank headquarters offices that can be turned into lofts and restaurants and brew pubs. So you sort of build out a theater district from this. And again, to your point, because nobody else was around there, there was this opportunity. Picking up on a point you made earlier, gentrification is a word that means a million different things to a million different people. In our book, we talk about sort of the Goldilocks effect, where a neighborhood starts to do better, but it doesn't happen at such a rapid rate where existing renters are displaced and affordable housing can be built. And so you see a lot of people talking about gentrification without displacement today as an achievable goal. In what you've seen, is gentrification and displacement sort of one and the same, where if a neighborhood improves, it just has to displace people? Or are there instances where, you know, this isn't a foregone conclusion?
I often try really hard, and I'm obviously not doing it in this conversation, but I often try really hard in my writing to avoid the word gentrification as much as humanly possible. I regularly fail at this, especially because like saying what you really mean in a headline is especially difficult. But I find that, I mean, it's almost irrelevant what I think that word means, because other people who will read things that I write will ascribe lots of different meanings to it. And in particular, you're sort of touching on one of the issues that I find especially tricky, that for some people, gentrification is synonymous with displacement. Like these two words literally are interchangeable with each other. And even the word displacement, I find to be somewhat tricky in that, you know, sometimes we'll see people describe, for instance, the decline of the African-American population in Washington, D.C., which has been quite dramatic, as being entirely displacement. And it's not true that everyone who moves out of the city is leaving unwillingly. I mean, there's also quite a lot of middle-class African-American households who historically were denied opportunities to own homes in the suburbs, and now those opportunities are available to them, and it is a step up for them to leave the city. And this language feels particularly important to me on this topic, because once you sort of accept that gentrification is synonymous with displacement and everyone who leaves a place is leaving unwillingly, then I feel like we sort of wind up in this really difficult place where any kind of investment in a community starts to feel problematic to people. And you know, now, and I've reported in communities where, you know, where this dynamic has become so deeply embedded in people's kind of fears about the future and their beliefs about development and things like that, that like the city finally comes in to invest in your public park, which the city has historically neglected because it's an African-American part of town. And the city is doing its job. That's what the city should do. And it's part of, you know, maybe the equity plan for the city to be disproportionately investing in these parks, for instance. But that can feel to people like, if you invest in my park, our property values are going to go up, gentrification is going to happen, higher income people are going to move in, we're all going to get pushed out. And it's just not a productive place for us to be in having policy conversations in cities, to assume that, you know, absolutely everything, whether it's investments in better bus service, in public goods, in a new grocery store coming in, to sort of equate that with, and it's going to be harmful to people here. So I usually try instead to just be very, very specific about what the process is that I'm talking about, or that I'm identifying, or that you see in data in different circumstances. So, you know, it is the case, for instance, that we see evictions rising in a particular census tract, or, you know, it is the case that the median new home sale has increased by 200%, and so now is clearly out of reach of people who used to live here. Like, those are real problems that I can name and identify, and we can all, you know, have a sort of shared understanding of what we're talking about. Because I really do, I just worry a lot of times in these conversations that how are we going to figure out how to invest in these historically disinvested communities if we're sort of stuck in this place where every form of investment feels problematic? Like, that just can't be the answer. You know, we need to have conversations instead about investment decisions being influenced and driven by longtime residents and what they would like to see in the neighborhood and things like that. So I would maybe think about it a little bit more as, like, what would an ideal of investment without displacement be, rather than sort of gentrification without displacement. But I also, I mean, to be honest, I cannot in my reporting point to a ton of neighborhoods where I'm like, this is the model right here. This is the place where I think, you know, did a really great job of this. And so I don't want to paint sort of an overly rosy picture here and suggest that these problems aren't real. But yeah, but I do think that, you know, people who are really pessimistic about the trajectory of neighborhood change and who benefits from that, you know, I think that they're right in many ways to feel sort of uncomfortable about it. But I often wish that we would all sort of talk about it with more specific language about what it is that we're really worried about.
I agree.
I think that's very fair. And Mac and I wrestled with this in the book. So, Mac, I believe we discuss, even when Baltimore gets its property tax revenue up, of what will be increases in public expenditure and how that will improve the local poor's quality of life. But I agree with Emily that there's several pieces to that logic chain that might not jump out at you as salient as if your rent goes up by 40%. Mac, a question for you on point. We talk in the book about land trusts as a way to give the people a piece of the action on land appreciation. Remind me what we say. I'm having a senior moment about the specifics about land trusts and giving people of a city an equity stake in local housing appreciation.
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting time to talk about this in the context of Baltimore, because this week the city announced funding for, I think it's 3 or 4 different community land trusts in 3 or 4 different neighborhoods around the city, where they're providing funding through an affordable housing trust fund that was set up some years ago, that is going to allow the development of affordable units in neighborhoods that are sort of, on the fence about whether they'll see rising housing prices in coming years. And this allows a sort of a permanent set aside of housing in these communities should prices escalate. And so it provides this buffer of opportunity for existing renters who won't have to get pushed out.
And Emily, to bring you back in, nerd urban economists have debated, why don't rental contracts go more years into the future? Would we be less concerned with gentrification if you could sign a 5-year rental contract? And so urban economists have been debating each other, why do we only have 1-year rental contracts? Emily, in any of your reporting, have you grappled with this issue?
I have never encountered a renter who said, I wish I could have a 5-year contract, but I do think that idea gets at this, gets at in a deeper sense what it is that people want in these communities, which is that they want some stability, they want some expectation that they will be able to stay. And so I think, there are a lot of interesting ideas, and community land trusts are one of them too, for like how do we carve out spaces within a neighborhood that's growing more expensive for people to be able to stay there, in particular renters. I mean, homeowners present sort of a different bucket of challenges, but for renters in particular. And I think one of the sort of tricky issues here is that you have to get your timing right with these ideas. So I've been in multiple communities where people said, we wish we had been setting up a land trust or been land banking 10 years ago. And especially in neighborhoods where property values are escalating really rapidly, like the window to do that closes very quickly, to where nonprofits or city governments can't afford to be buying up these parcels anymore. And so it's almost like, in order for these ideas to work, you have to be thinking even farther ahead and be even quicker on the ball than developers and speculators are, which is like an incredibly absurd thing to ask of nonprofits and overworked government housing agency staff. And I also think that it's often the instinct of cities to sort of say, let's attract for-profit development and raise the tax base. And then once we've raised the tax base, then we'll have some money we can invest in this kind of stuff. But of course, that's like putting the horse before the cart. Like if you say, let's sort of flip the switch to development that causes property values to escalate, and then once we get that underway, we'll have enough money to invest in buying properties. Like, well, now those properties are a lot more expensive than they would have been if you had done it in the first place. And so I don't totally know the answer to how you would solve that. I mean, there's a certain amount of probably luck involved in, communities that are able to lock down and protect housing and parcels of land before things get really out of hand. But I do think that, what people want is some sense of stability and that they know that there will be a home for them in the future in a place that's rapidly changing, and maybe giving people longer leases will at least do that for a small number of people in the sort of medium term.
Picking up on this theme of stability in neighborhoods, one of the things you see when you get an influx of wealthy white residents into a neighborhood is a change in the commercial and retail space. So you'll see hipster cafes and shops selling mustache wax and novelty candles. But earlier this week, I was reading about a neighborhood called Germantown in Philadelphia, and they've seen rising house prices in recent years, but they have been able to, to a large extent, maintain some of the neighborhood's character. And a lot of what they were attributing that to is maintaining sort of the commercial mix of businesses and shared public spaces and sort of cultural spaces in neighborhoods. So in what you've seen, sort of how important are shared public spaces where newcomers and existing residents can interact on an equal footing?
I think what we get really focused a lot of times on looking at what's happening to residents, and of course there's this whole parallel story of what's happening to business owners and commercial shops that's really important, and that's tied into all of this too. And some of it is like just purely functional, like if all of the laundromats close and I'm a low-income person and I don't have access to laundry in my building, like now you've literally like removed my ability to take care of my basic needs within my neighborhood. Or all of the Black barbershops have been forced to close because the rent was raised on them, and now there is nowhere where I can go and get my hair cut, or where I go and I find a sense of community with other people in my community. So that's part of it. Is part of the challenge is finding ways to preserve longtime businesses, which is slightly different from like having businesses that everyone would mix and mingle at. But I do think that there's a lot of tension that arises from like, getting rid of the laundromat, and what you're replacing it with is like a very expensive wine bar where no one who's lived there for a long time, who's of moderate income, would go. Like that's alienating to people. It's in your face every time you walk by it. I totally understand why, that contributes to tension and frustration within these neighborhoods. I'm trying to think about like what kinds of businesses would those look like that everyone can patronize together. And I certainly think that there are such places. Grocery stores are obviously going to be an example of that. Probably not if we're talking about a Whole Foods, but if we're talking about like a Giant or a Safeway coming into a neighborhood that hasn't had one in a long time, like that is an example of something that would help make a neighborhood attractive to higher income residents, but would also like serve a genuine need of people who've lived there for a long time. But the other thing that your question makes me think of is that like, there are other kind of third spaces in a neighborhood that are not commercial in nature. They're churches, or the really obvious one to me is a public school. Like, are newcomers and people who've lived in a neighborhood for a very long time, are they sharing those institutions as well? Because I think in a community where they are not sharing those institutions, public schools especially, I think you're going to have a very hard time sort of creating a truly cohesive, racially and socioeconomically diverse neighborhood where, foundational institutions to it are serving only part of the community, and the other part of the community wants to have nothing to do with them.
So Mac, on that point, correct me, you researched the point that in the city of Detroit schools these days, only 2% of the students are white. So I think that directly supports Emily's point that's an ugly fact. And Emily, in any of your reporting, and I've read many of your pieces, but this issue of social cohesion in cities, have you written a piece on this sharing of public institutions, like in New York City, the diversity of people on the buses and subways versus in the Detroit's public schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the New York subway is a perfect example of this. I've been thinking about this a lot during the pandemic, because the pandemic has created this situation where, to the extent that these kinds of places exist, we have retreated from them. So, you know, public libraries, where I live in Washington, DC, there's a really wonderful neighborhood public pool that the city invested a ton of money in about a decade ago or so. And, you know, anecdotally, it's used by everybody in the community. So yeah, libraries, pools, parks, in some places, the subway, where it exists, more likely than buses. These are places where I think there's value to people being present in the same space, even if you are not literally interacting or making new friends, or, you know, this sort of sense that this is an asset for all of us, that, like, you know, I want my tax dollars to provide this thing for me, but it's also going to provide this thing for my neighbors. And yeah, and so one of the things that's been sort of like troubling to me during the pandemic is that those places, or even I thought about this example, like the DMV is a place where absolutely everyone has to like come together and sit in a room together. And literally the DMV has been closed for the past year and nobody has gone and had that experience. And it's just, maybe this is like naive of me, and economists would say we can't measure that this is actually true, but I feel like, yeah, there's benefits to, like, you know, being forced to realize that you share this city or this community with people who look different from you, or yeah, just these places where we're forced to come together, and we've not been coming together in those places over the last year, which is really unfortunate. But the absence of that has also like made it more visible to me, like where those places are in my community, like the DMV. So I do think, yeah, I do think that stuff matters.
I agree, and I now have a new appreciation for the DMV.
Yeah, I think, you know, building on your point, another potential space for mixing of people that normally wouldn't gather together, that has not been an option in the past year, is sporting events.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, again, you'd see people come from all different neighborhoods, tens of thousands of them, and we haven't had that. We've, you know, been watching at home, so it's really a lost opportunity. But sort of looking at this idea of preservation and stability from another angle, again, sort of looking at the period of late 90s to today, a lot of downtowns or historic places that have old, beautiful brick buildings that people have really started to value more and more. And this has created a conflict as, you know, developers might want to come in and build a 20-story glass mixed-use apartment complex. So in what you've seen, what role has historic preservation played in gentrification, and what is this conflict between longtime homeowners who want to preserve the look and historic feel of their neighborhood? How does that play out against people that want to see, you know, progress and change and increased density in their city?
So I'm going to be a little bit hypocritical about this, and I'm like totally at peace with my hypocrisy about this. I am all for giving higher income white neighbors a hard time about saying, you know, I don't want new development in my neighborhood. You know, it'll change the character of my neighborhood. You know, these sort of like phrases, which basically mean like, let's just please preserve everything in amber. I think we should call that out when we see it, and we should be explicit about what these people are really doing, which is blocking other people from being able to live in their community. Saying, you know, I got here, I pull up the drawbridge, I don't want anybody else to come here. And I think it's totally fair game, and I am perfectly comfortable myself sort of giving people a hard time about doing this in affluent communities. But where I'm going to say I'm going to be a little bit of a hypocrite, sometimes there's the temptation to say, you know, well, we should take the exact same attitude in lower income communities of color and say, you know, you need to be open to new development too. Like, you're trying to preserve your community in amber, and, you know, you're standing in the way of progress, and you're not allowing more people to move in. And it's true that sort of, especially from an urban economist point of view, like the same principle applies. Like, cities are living, breathing things that change over time, and we need to not stand in the way of them changing. In principle, I believe that that's true, but I also believe that we need to have a different conversation about that in different kinds of communities. So, you know, we need to recognize that the concerns of a historically disinvested, predominantly African-American, low-income community that is fearful of new development is a different set of concerns than a, you know, overwhelmingly single-family home, owner-occupied neighborhood full of predominantly white homeowners saying, you know, I don't want new development in my neighborhood. Like, it sort of sounds like they're saying the same thing, but they're not really saying the same thing, I think. Is what I'm saying making any sense? I mean, I think part of what has gotten folks in the yes in my backyard movement in some trouble is sort of applying the same sweeping argument that we need more development in all kinds of different places, and not appreciating that sounds different in different kinds of communities, and that we should sort of maybe modulate our expectation of where development happens in different communities. And so, you know, if you sort of take a historical look at it, you know, what you come to appreciate is that development tends to get forced onto lower income communities because higher income communities are much better at blocking it, and it needs to go somewhere, so it gets pushed into lower income communities. And so if you acknowledge that force is true, and that's historically what's happened, then I think we can say, like, let's give a little more power to low income communities to say, you know, we're not comfortable with that, or we want more of a voice in what's going to be built. And yeah, so I said I was going to be hypocritical about it, to the extent that, like, I'm okay with having sort of like different standards in these two separate kinds of communities for how much we're going to give people a hard time about wanting to preserve the status quo.
Emily, that is very logical. So permit me to ask a non-logical, strange question. If you had the chance to sit down with Jane Jacobs in thinking about would there be any point that you would debate her on these issues of historic preservation? I realize that's a distinctive question. Are there any points? If that's not a well-posed question, we could just skip it. But any points of where you could have an interesting debate with her and her very important views on what's a well-functioning city?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's maybe sort of not fair to have expected Jane Jacobs, looking at the city that had existed around her 50 years ago, to have anticipated the kinds of problems in the neighborhoods that we have now.
He was very smart.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking now about urban renewal that's raising entire blocks of communities and plopping big, ugly, useless institutions on top of them. You know, now we have like a polar opposite problem in many communities. But I do think, and I don't know, I would probably disagree with her to the extent that, you know, I'm sort of convinced by urban economists of the need to, like, part of change over time also means like combining parcels and recognizing that, like, everything can't be a 16-foot wide shop front with 2 apartments above it. Like, more density means combining parcels and creating sort of, you know, very different shaped buildings that serve kind of different purposes. And And so I think there needs to be sort of room for all of this stuff. But yeah, but I mean, she had a lot less reason to be worried about the people who don't yet live in her neighborhood who would like to live there than you would now have to worry about in New York in 2021.
So you wrote a very interesting article a couple of years ago, I think it was, about a community in DC that had been affected by the riots in the 60s and had seen a large influx of investment in recent years, and it looked sort of completely different than what it had back then. In our book, we discuss Paul Krugman's idea of history and expectations as driving investment patterns. We talk about it in the context of cities. And so, again, looking at places like that neighborhood in DC that experienced divestment after the riots in the 60s and declining home values, there was a lasting expectation that these places would continue to be risky investments. So people invested elsewhere and they got sort of hollowed out. And so in this article, you looked at, I think, a couple neighborhoods that experienced the sort of cycle of disinvestment and then sort of wholesale investment. And I think Over the Rhine in Cincinnati, Liberty City in Miami were two of the other ones, in addition to the sort of 14th and U Street corridor in DC. So, how's this similar to historic events like we saw in the Great Fire in Boston in the 1870s, or the firebombing of Dresden in World War II? What does this tell us about patterns of urban development?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot about this last summer when we were, we were in this moment of renewed urban unrest in lots of cities around the country, which felt in some ways like 1968, but in many ways was nowhere near as sort of destructive or violent. Obviously, it was much more sort of peaceful in this case, but it sort of sent me down a rabbit hole of spending a lot of time reading about what was happening in the 1960s. And what was especially apparent to me, because I'm based in Washington, DC, is that the neighborhoods here that experienced the most unrest in 1968 and the most property destruction that emerged from that are today the neighborhoods that anyone in Washington would recognize as the places that have undergone the most incredibly dramatic change in the last 10, 15 years. So, it's the 14th Street corridor and the 14th and U intersection, the Shaw neighborhood, and then the H Street corridor in Washington. And all of these are places where what you see now is vastly larger scale development. So, 6 to 8 story apartment buildings that are largely rentals that are, have luxury touches in them and, rent for an enormous amount of money. And then they have SoulCycle spas on the ground floor and, incredibly high-end ice creameries and things like that. This is sort of what these neighborhoods look like now. And it sort of felt to me like this is not a coincidence that these neighborhoods that experience the most destruction have also experienced, flash forward 2 generations, the most dramatic kind of reinvention and redevelopment. And I mean, you guys have thought about this as well in thinking about urban economics. I mean, one of the things that sort of became more clear to me as I was trying to learn more about this is that there's a certain extent to which destruction at a very large scale kind of paves the way for very large scale redevelopment. So, at the scale of an individual block, if literally every parcel on that block becomes vacant and abandoned and goes into tax foreclosure and gets bought up by the city, over the course of decades, that makes it logistically a whole lot easier for the city to sell it to a developer to combine all those parcels to build something that's much larger and looks dramatically different. And so that's at the scale of an individual block, but the same is true at the scale of an entire neighborhood or an entire commercial corridor. If you have just tremendous disinvestment, you know, you sort of start to create the conditions once the economics make this viable to have a developer say, I'm going to put a 50-unit high-end apartment building here because I'm pretty sure another developer is going to put a 50-unit high-end apartment building next to me, and that probably then a Whole Foods is going to go in there. And this is literally what happened on 14th Street. This is also what happened on H Street. A Whole Foods went in each of these locations and really sort of like anchored this massive redevelopment of high-end housing. And you asked about sort of historical examples of this. And one of the things that I came across was this, you know, this really interesting research that documents how in Boston in the 1870s, when they had a tremendous fire there that destroyed much of the downtown, you know, this is a terrible tragedy. It destroys lots of people's property. You know, it's a tragedy on many levels, but from an economist's point of view, you know, what it does is it sort of clears the way for lots of simultaneous redevelopment. And maybe I am more likely to invest in my building when I know that everybody else around me is redeveloping as well. And so just what all of this got me thinking a lot about is the way that destruction sets the stage for redevelopment. And I'm not celebrating this. I'm not saying that this is a good thing. And I'm also not saying that, you know, everywhere that gets destroyed ultimately like rises from the ashes in some spectacular redevelopment. There are many neighborhoods where this is not true. There are many neighborhoods that were destroyed during rioting in the 1960s where we have not seen dramatic redevelopment. But when you devalue a place so substantially over time, you make it more viable for a developer to come in and revalue it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think a point that we make in our book is so Emily, I agree, but I would add that there's questions of product fundamentals. For example, if the parcel is close to beauty in Baltimore, close to the water, and I know you agree, of something anchoring its value, that accelerates the comeback.
Yeah, I mean, another way that I think about this is at the level of individual row homes in Washington, D.C. So, you know, there are neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. that have remained sort of solidly middle class or more affluent for decades. And what happens with the housing stock is the people who live in it, you know, invest in it piecemeal and keep it up sort of piecemeal over time. And, you know, that housing stock looks today very much like it did 80 years ago. And then there are neighborhoods where, you know, there was tremendous disinvestment, where homeowners could not get loans, where, you know, the city was not investing in public works in those communities. And those homes over time lose more and more of their value. And, but if they happen to be located in a community that has those kind of underlying assets like you were just describing, Matt, like you know, they're close to downtown, you know, now they're in a place where we're likely to see a lot of redevelopment. What happens is a developer comes in and buys up what is an incredibly devalued property. And what they do is in Washington, they put a pop-up on it and they turn it into a luxury $1 million home. And so you have these conditions where economically it makes sense to buy a disinvested $300,000 house and turn it around and flip it into a $1 million home. But if that $300,000 house had been, if the homeowners in it for decades had been allowed to maintain it and sort of keep it as a stable part of the housing stock in good condition, it would never make sense for a developer to buy it and try to flip it. Like the economics of it just don't make sense. So like, to me, this process has been very clear to me at the scale of like individual houses, because I see this happening around me in the city. But I think that same process plays out, you know, with parcels, it plays out with whole neighborhoods, it plays out with whole commercial corridors.
Yeah, and I think looking at a different scale, you see this in Baltimore around the Port Covington development, which used to be, you know, an old sort of railroad terminus. And it was one of the few remaining parts of land in the city that had waterfront access. And now you see essentially you know, a mini city being built up there, and they just broke ground on the first sort of vertical building of that this week. So it's going to be interesting to follow.
Yeah, I mean, what makes that land so valuable is that it's got scale, is that as a developer, you can build a whole neighborhood there. Like the possibilities for you are not just that you can build one building, but you can, you know, you can build something really, really big. And that, and the scale in and of itself renders any individual piece of that larger thing more valuable than it would be if it were just that one thing by itself.
Exactly. So to end our discussion today, if there was one myth you would like to dispel about gentrification, or one fact that you think people should know, that you think a lot of people don't know about gentrification, what would it be?
Oh boy, that's tough. I guess it would be that what it is we're really worried about here is more pervasive than just, you know, a handful of expensive coastal cities. And so to people who say, like, we all spend too much time talking about gentrification, I think that that's not right. I think that, you know, the forces that we're talking about and the challenges that we're describing affect more people than just a handful of communities. You know, I suppose sort of the same could be said to come back to where our conversation started, that you know, it's also true that like every low-income neighborhood that gets an investment in its park is not necessarily bound to like go down these processes that we're talking about. Yeah, so I guess what I would end on is that it's both sort of like more pervasive and less ubiquitous than the public conversation often treats it as. It's either sort of one of those two things. But as with most things, it's like somewhere in the middle.
Well said.
Emily, so Emily, I can't resist. In 2021, what are some urban stories you'll be working on? Can you give us a preview of future New York Times front pages with you as the byline?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm really preoccupied by right now is, you know, how do we emerge from the pandemic? You know, that question touches everything. It's about, you know, our migration patterns radically going to change because people are working from home? Are downtown's going to become fundamentally different places because, you know, the demand for office buildings is less? And you know, what is going to happen to our public transit agencies if lots of people either aren't commuting to work or are newly fearful of riding public transit, or because they went out and bought a car over the last year? You know, what like the pandemic has made so incredibly clear, like all of these problems with urban inequality, and that we have, you know, this class of very wealthy people with a lot of disposable income to spend, and then we have this service sector class which serves those people, and the sort of relationship between those two groups and the ways that relationship can be problematic has been very, very clear to me during the pandemic. And so, you know, can we find ways to create more equity in cities coming out of the pandemic? I mean, everything is, yeah, everything you see me write this year will have the word pandemic in it.
So I'm going to spend less time reading the New York Post, and I'm going to return to reading these columns. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks to you guys for including me in the conversations around your book, and congratulations on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.